They tell you from the moment you are old enough to understand words that family is everything. They drill it into your head through movies, books, and unsolicited advice from strangers. Blood is thicker than water, unconditional love is a biological guarantee, and no matter how toxic things get, you always forgive your parents. I used to believe that garbage. I used to think that no matter how blatantly my parents favored my younger brother, deep down, there was a baseline of respect, a line they would never, ever cross. But trauma and financial ruin have a funny way of completely rewriting your worldview. I am here to tell you that unconditional love is a dangerous myth, and sometimes the people who share your DNA are nothing more than financial parasites waiting for you to turn your back so they can bleed you dry. But I am not a victim. I am the architect of their absolute destruction. My name is Alice. I am 32 years old, and for my entire life, I have been the undisputed black sheep of my family. I didn't earn this title by doing anything wrong. I earned it by being entirely self-sufficient, fiercely independent, and refusing to bend the knee to the delusion that my younger brother, Leo, was the second coming of Christ. Leo is 28, and he is the textbook, terrifying definition of a golden child. While I spent my 20s working grueling 80-hour weeks in corporate software sales, aggressively saving every penny, and building an actual career, Leo was busy finding himself. He is a serial entrepreneur, which is just a polite modern term for an unemployed narcissist whose expensive hobbies are entirely funded by his enabling parents. He failed at a crypto startup, he bankrupted a boutique sneaker resale business, and he crashed a luxury car rental service. Every single time he failed, my parents bailed him out, drained their savings, and blamed the economy, the market, or his jealous business partners. Nothing was ever Leo's fault. The only person in my family who saw through this psychotic dynamic was my maternal grandfather. He was a tough, self-made man who respected hard work above everything else. He and I were incredibly close. When I was 29, he passed away. It shattered my heart, but in his will, he did something that caused an absolute, irreconcilable earthquake in my family. He left his entire estate, specifically a stunning, completely paid-off mid-century modern home on 2 acres of pristine woodland, entirely to me. He didn't leave a single dime to my parents, and he explicitly stated in his will that Leo was to receive absolutely nothing, noting that Leo had already squandered enough of the family's resources. The reaction from my parents was not grief. It was an explosion of pure, vitriolic rage. During the reading of the will at the attorney's office, my mother literally stood up, her face purple, and screamed that the will had to be contested. When the lawyer calmly explained that the document was ironclad, she turned her absolute fury onto me. For the next 3 months, my phone did not stop ringing. My parents demanded, pleaded, and eventually threatened me, insisting that I do the right thing and sign the deed of the house over to Leo. They claimed he needed a win, and that since I already had a good salary, it was deeply selfish of me to keep a house I didn't need. I told them to go to hell, blocked their numbers, and went strictly, beautifully no contact. I moved into my grandfather's house, spent my own money renovating it, and spent 2 blissful years enjoying the absolute silence of a life without my toxic family. I thought I had won. I thought the nightmare was permanently over. I was so incredibly naive to underestimate the sheer, predatory desperation of an enabling mother trying to save her golden child. It happened on a random, sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my home office, sipping a coffee, looking out the large glass windows at the trees. My car was getting older, and I had finally decided to treat myself to a brand new SUV. As a standard procedure before heading to the dealership, I logged onto my banking portal to pull my official credit report, expecting to see my usual flawless score of over 800. The screen loaded. The number flashing back at me was 520. I blinked, assuming it was a glitch. I refreshed the page, The number stayed the same. A giant, glaring red banner across the top of the screen alerted me to a critical derogatory mark and a severely delinquent account. My heart instantly dropped into my stomach. My hands began to shake as I clicked on the detailed report, scrolling down past my perfectly paid credit cards and my non-existent student loans. There it was. Nestled in the liability section was a home equity line of credit, HELOC. It was attached directly to the deed of my grandfather's house. The total borrowed amount was $400,000. For a full 60 seconds, all the air was completely sucked out of the room. The physical sensation of panic was so violent, it felt like a heart attack. Someone had taken out a massive $400,000 mortgage against my completely paid-off home. Not only had the money been fully withdrawn over the last 6 months in massive wire transfers, but the account was now 90 days past due. The bank was legally preparing to put a lien on my property. My home, the only sanctuary I had in the world, the final gift from my grandfather, was on the verge of being foreclosed on to pay off a debt I didn't even know existed. I didn't cry. I grabbed my keys, practically sprinted to my car, and broke several speed limits driving directly to the main branch of the bank listed on the credit report. I marched up to the branch manager's desk, slammed my driver's license onto the table, and demanded to see every single piece of paperwork associated with the HELOC attached to my address. The manager, seeing the absolute murderous panic in my eyes, rushed to pull the physical file from the archives. 10 minutes later, he placed a thick manila folder in front of me. "Ma'am, this line of credit was opened in person at a different branch across town roughly 7 months ago," he said nervously. "The applicant presented your social security card, your birth certificate, and the original deed to the house. The documents were fully notarized." I opened the folder. The first page was the master loan agreement. I scanned down to the bottom right corner, looking at the signature line. It wasn't my signature. It wasn't even a good forgery. The person who signed it hadn't even tried to mimic my sharp, angular handwriting. The signature was flowing, elegant, and finished with a very distinct, looping flourish on the last letter. It was a signature I had seen on every single birthday card I had ever received as a child. It was a signature I had seen on my high school permission slips. It was my mother's handwriting. I sat there in the quiet, air-conditioned bank office, staring at the ink as the horrific reality washed over me. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me. She had kept my old backup identity documents from when I was a teenager. She had taken them, walked into a bank, impersonated me, and forged my name on federal banking documents. I flipped to the notary stamp. The name of the notary public was Susan Miller, my mother's best friend from her country club, a woman who had known me since I was a toddler. They had conspired together. They had committed massive, coordinated financial fraud, risking federal prison time just to extract the equity out of my grandfather's house. But where did $400,000 go? I pulled out my phone. My hands were no longer shaking. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, terrifying clarity. I opened Instagram, searched for my brother Leo's profile, which I hadn't looked at in 2 years, and scrolled down. There it was. 6 months ago, Leo had posted a photo of himself holding a glass of champagne in front of a massive, gutted commercial building in the downtown luxury district. The caption read, "Big moves. Finally secured the funding for my dream project. The Golden Spoon restaurant opening soon. Thanks to my amazing family for believing in my vision when no one else did." Subsequent photos showed him installing imported Italian marble countertops, buying state-of-the-art industrial kitchen equipment, and hiring a pretentious executive chef. He was building a $500,000 vanity restaurant, and he was funding every single brick, every single bottle of wine, and every single paycheck with the stolen equity of my home. They had turned my life into an ATM for the golden child. I slowly closed the folder and handed it back to the branch manager. I didn't scream. I didn't say a word about the forgery. If I reported it to the police right now, the bank would freeze the remaining funds, Leo would declare bankruptcy, and the money would be gone forever, leaving me tied up in years of agonizing litigation to clear my house's title. No, that was too easy. That was too quick. I walked out of the bank, got into my car, and smiled. I wasn't going to stop him. I was going to let Leo finish building his beautiful, expensive restaurant. I was going to let him taste the success he felt so desperately entitled to. And then, on the most important day of his pathetic life, I was going to drop a nuclear bomb on all of them. The hardest thing I have ever had to do in my entire life was walk out of that bank and do absolutely nothing. Every single human instinct, every shred of adrenaline pumping through my nervous system was screaming at me to call the police, to drive straight to my parents' house, to kick down their front door, and to scream until my lungs bled. I wanted to grab my mother by the shoulders and demand to know how she could look at me, her own flesh and blood, and casually decide to destroy my entire future just to fund another one of her golden boy's delusions. But rage is a sloppy, dangerous emotion. It makes you reckless. It makes you play your hand too early. If I had stormed into the police precinct that afternoon, my mother would have immediately played the victim. She would have cried, hired a cheap defense attorney, and claimed it was a simple family misunderstanding. Or worse, lied and said I had given her verbal permission and was now vindictively changing my mind. Meanwhile, Leo would have immediately filed for bankruptcy to protect the remaining cash, tying up my grandfather's house in years of agonizing, expensive probate and bankruptcy litigation. I would have been stuck fighting a stressful defensive war just to get my own property back. I didn't want a defensive war. I wanted an absolute massacre. To orchestrate a massacre, you need elite mercenaries. The very next morning, I withdrew a substantial chunk of my own legitimate corporate savings and walked into the towering glass-paneled downtown office of Sterling & Vance, a premier litigation firm. I didn't want a friendly family lawyer. I hired Arthur Sterling, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into high-stakes financial fraud and asset recovery. He was astronomically expensive, famously ruthless, and completely devoid of sentimentality. I sat across his massive mahogany desk, placed the copy of the forged loan agreement between us, and explained exactly what my mother and her country club notary friend had done. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts with the cold precision of a corporate merger. Arthur listened in absolute silence, his sharp eyes scanning the fraudulent signature. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Your mother hasn't just committed fraud, Alice," Arthur explained, tapping a high-end fountain pen against the desk. "She has committed federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and wire fraud. Because the funds were electronically transferred using federal banking systems, she has invited the FBI directly into her living room. And Susan, the notary, has forfeited her state license and is looking at felony accessory charges. They handed you the murder weapon, and they were stupid enough to leave their fingerprints all over the handle. Over the next 4 months, while my brother Leo was busy playing pretend CEO, Arthur and I built an airtight, bulletproof vault of evidence. I hired a private investigator with a background in forensic accounting to quietly trace every single penny of the $400,000. The arrogance of my family was honestly staggering. They hadn't even tried to launder or hide the money trail. The HELOC funds had been deposited into a joint checking account my mother shared with my father. Within 48 hours of the loan clearing, 3 massive wire transfers had been sent directly into the commercial business account of Golden Spoon Hospitality LLC, a company solely registered under Leo's name. My mother had literally stolen the equity from my home and handed the cash directly to her son. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the notary. My private investigator managed to subpoena the bank's lobby security footage from the exact day the loan was signed. The high-definition video clearly showed my mother walking into the branch, sitting at a desk with Susan the notary, and confidently signing a thick stack of documents. I was nowhere to be seen. The digital timestamp on the security footage exactly matched the timestamp on the forged loan agreement. We had them dead to rights. We had the smoking gun, the established motive, and the undeniable money trail. The psychological toll of those 4 months of silence was excruciating. I had to maintain absolute radio silence. I couldn't confront them, and I had to sit back and watch them parade their stolen wealth in front of the entire world. Leo's social media presence became a masterclass in unbearable narcissistic entitlement. He posted daily updates on his restaurant's construction. I sat in my home office, watching high-definition Instagram stories of him bragging about the custom-imported Italian pizza oven he had just purchased, an oven paid for entirely by the stolen equity of my home. I watched him pose for professional photos holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, the caption reading, "Self-made. Never let anyone tell you that your dreams are too big. Hard work pays off." It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to smash my phone against the wall, but the absolute worst part wasn't Leo. It was my parents. My mother constantly commented on his posts, leaving strings of heart emojis and writing things like, "So proud of my brilliant boy. You deserve this success more than anyone." She was publicly celebrating the business she had built by slitting her daughter's financial throat. She slept soundly at night, completely convinced she had gotten away with the perfect crime. But while Leo was buying gold leaf interior decorations and hiring a pretentious PR firm, Arthur and I were drafting the legal equivalent of a firing squad. We didn't just file a civil lawsuit. Arthur bypassed the local police entirely and took our massive dossier straight to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, as well as the United States Attorney's Office. Because the evidence of forgery was absolute and the dollar amount crossed the threshold for federal prosecution, the authorities didn't hesitate. They opened a quiet, sealed investigation. They secured grand jury indictments under seal. They prepared federal asset seizure warrants for the restaurant because every single piece of equipment inside that building had been purchased with the direct proceeds of a federal crime. The timing of our strike had to be absolutely flawless. We couldn't strike while the restaurant was under construction because Leo could just walk away and claim ignorance. We needed him to be fully, completely invested. We needed him to sign personal guarantees with vendors, hire staff, and invite every single important person in the city to witness his grand triumph. We needed his ego to be inflated to its absolute maximum capacity before we took a needle to it. And then the golden opportunity finally arrived. It was a Tuesday morning when the targeted advertisement popped up on my social media feed. It was a slick, professionally produced video announcing the highly anticipated grand opening of the Golden Spoon. The event was scheduled for a Saturday evening, exactly 3 weeks away. It was being billed as the culinary event of the year. The ad boasted an exclusive VIP guest list, a red carpet, local food influencers, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony hosted by the city's elite. Leo had gone all out. He was planning to publicly crown himself the king of the local restaurant scene. I forwarded the advertisement directly to Arthur. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a reply from my lawyer. It was a single sentence that made a cold, euphoric thrill run down my spine. "Tell the feds we have our date. The raid happens on Saturday." Saturday arrived with a sickeningly beautiful golden hour sunset. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect breezy evening that event planners pray for when organizing an outdoor red carpet affair. The universe seemed to be handing my brother the most glorious, triumphant night of his entire existence. But I knew something the universe didn't. The forecast didn't call for rain, but a Category 5 hurricane was about to make direct landfall on the Golden Spoon, and I was the one controlling the weather. I didn't spend the afternoon getting my hair blown out or trying on designer gowns. I wasn't going to a party. I was going to an execution. I stood in my bedroom, staring into the full-length mirror and methodically dressed for war. I put on a tailored, razor-sharp black blazer, matching trousers, and a pair of black stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight bun. I applied minimal makeup. I didn't want to look beautiful or festive. I wanted to look like the absolute, undeniable manifestation of a consequence. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the black sheep of the family anymore. I saw a predator who had finally cornered her prey. At exactly 6:15 p.m., a sleek black Lincoln Navigator pulled up to my driveway. My attorney, Arthur, was sitting in the back seat, wearing a dark, intimidating bespoke suit. He looked less like a corporate lawyer and more like a high-ranking mafia underboss about to oversee a hit. I slid into the leather seat next to him. He didn't offer a warm greeting. He just tapped his manicured finger on a thick leather portfolio resting on his lap. "The warrants are signed, sealed, and currently in the hands of the United States Marshals," Arthur stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "The FBI White-Collar Division has an undercover agent already inside the venue, posing as a freelance photographer to ensure the primary targets, your mother and your brother, are present and consolidated. The raid convoy is staging 2 blocks away. They move on my signal." "Perfect," I whispered, feeling an icy, euphoric calm wash over my entire nervous system. The drive downtown took 30 minutes. As our SUV turned onto the affluent, bustling street of the luxury restaurant district, the sheer scale of my brother's audacity finally came into full view. The Golden Spoon was a corner lot, taking up prime, obscenely expensive real estate. Leo had completely gutted the historic building and transformed it into a monument to his own raging narcissism. The facade was painted a sleek matte black, accented with genuine gold leaf lettering. A massive, custom-built awning stretched over the sidewalk. Arthur's driver pulled our SUV over to the curb directly across the street, killing the headlights. We sat in the darkness behind the heavily tinted windows, giving us a front-row cinematic view of the spectacle. It was a masterclass in superficial arrogance. Leo had hired a boutique PR firm to manufacture a scene straight out of Hollywood. A literal red carpet was rolled out across the pavement, flanked by heavy velvet ropes and polished brass stanchions. A string quartet was playing classical music near the entrance. Dozens of local food influencers, minor local celebrities, and wealthy socialites were milling around, sipping vintage champagne from crystal flutes provided by circulating waiters in crisp white tuxedos. I looked at the imported Italian marble hostess stand. I looked at the custom, blown glass chandeliers glowing warmly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked at the massive floral arrangements of imported white orchids. I paid for every single petal, I thought to myself. I paid for every drop of that champagne. I paid for the velvet ropes. It is all mine. And then I saw them. My brother Leo stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors, looking like he had just won an Oscar. He was wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was perfectly styled, his teeth blindingly white, and he was holding court, laughing loudly with a group of local journalists. He looked incredibly, unspeakably smug. He believed he was a self-made titan of industry. He believed his genius had finally been recognized by the world. Standing right beside him, beaming with an intoxicating, toxic pride, were my parents. My father was wearing a rented tuxedo, looking profoundly out of place but desperately trying to project wealth. But it was my mother who made my blood run entirely cold. She was wearing a floor-length, heavily beaded designer gown. She was draped in expensive jewelry. She was holding a glass of champagne, smiling for the flashing cameras, looking like the proud matriarch of a successful dynasty. She had stolen $400,000 from her own daughter, risked sending herself to federal prison, and nearly caused the foreclosure of my grandfather's home, all so she could stand on this red carpet and pretend to be high society. The sheer sociopathic delusion required to smile for a camera while standing on a foundation of massive federal fraud was breathtaking. At 6:55 p.m., the PR director, a frantic woman with an earpiece, stepped up to a microphone set up near the entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice echoing down the street. "If I could have your attention, we are about to officially cut the ribbon and open the doors to the finest dining experience this city has ever seen. Please, a warm round of applause for the visionary, the founder, and the CEO of the Golden Spoon, Leo." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Leo handed his champagne flute to a waiter and confidently stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted his bow tie, looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, and smiled. "Thank you," Leo spoke, his voice dripping with faux humility. "Thank you all so much for being here. They say that building an empire takes blood, sweat, and tears. And let me tell you, this restaurant is the culmination of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and an unwavering belief in my own vision. When people told me I couldn't do it, I pushed harder, because true success is self-made." Inside the SUV, Arthur let out a dry, chilling chuckle. "Self-made," he muttered. "That's a very creative defense strategy." Leo continued his speech, the hypocrisy thickening the air. "But I didn't do it completely alone. I want to give a special, incredibly heartfelt thank you to my amazing parents. To my mother, the woman who always believed in me, who supported my dreams when no one else did, and who literally made this entire night possible. Mom, I love you." My mother put a hand over her heart, a single theatrical tear rolling down her cheek as the crowd awed and clapped for her. I looked at my phone. The digital clock rolled over to 7 p.m., the exact time of the grand opening, the exact time the trap was scheduled to snap shut. I turned my head and looked at Arthur in the dim light of the SUV. I didn't smile. I just gave him a single, definitive nod. Arthur pulled a sleek black radio from his jacket pocket, pressed the transmission button, and spoke 2 words that would permanently end my family's lives. "Execute warrants." The 2 words from Arthur's radio hung in the heavy, leather-scented air of the SUV for exactly 5 seconds. Outside, on the glowing red carpet, Leo had just been handed a pair of absurdly oversized, gold-plated ceremonial scissors by his frantic PR director. He was raising them high above his head, posing for the blinding flashes of a dozen local media photographers, his teeth bared in a sickeningly triumphant smile. My mother was standing to his right, her hands clasped together in performative, maternal adoration. The string quartet reached a soaring crescendo. It was the absolute, undisputed peak of my brother's arrogant, delusional existence. And then the universe violently course-corrected. It didn't begin with a single siren. It began with a synchronized, deafening roar that shattered the elegant ambiance of the luxury district. From both ends of the intersection, a massive, coordinated fleet of vehicles swarmed the block. There were no polite warnings. 2 heavy, unmarked black tactical SUVs aggressively jumped the curb, their tires squealing against the pavement, completely blocking the valet lane. 3 black and white local police cruisers boxed in the rear, while a larger federal transport van slammed into park directly in front of the red carpet. The blinding, strobing explosion of red and blue emergency lights instantly washed over the pristine white marble facade of the Golden Spoon, turning the elegant champagne reception into a chaotic, terrifying crime scene. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, producing a horrific, screeching discord of cello strings. The crowd of wealthy socialites, food influencers, and journalists froze in absolute breathless paralysis. A few people screamed as heavily armed, stern-faced men and women wearing tactical vests emblazoned with U.S. Marshals and windbreakers reading FBI poured out of the vehicles with terrifying military precision. Leo lowered the golden scissors, his smug smile faltering into an expression of profound infantile confusion. He stepped forward, raising his free hand, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. He actually believed he still had authority. "Excuse me," Leo shouted into his microphone, his voice echoing awkwardly over the wailing sirens. "Hey, what is going on here? You can't park those vehicles there. This is a private VIP event. We have a permit for this street closure." The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing man with a jawline carved from granite, didn't even acknowledge Leo's existence. He marched straight up the middle of the red carpet, his heavy boots trampling right over the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the frantic PR director who tried to step in his way. Two armed marshals flanked him, their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts. The undercover agent, who had been posing as a photographer, smoothly stepped out of the crowd, flashing a golden badge, and positioned himself behind my parents, effectively cutting off their only avenue of escape. The lead agent stopped 3 feet away from my family. He didn't look at my brother. He locked his cold, uncompromising eyes directly onto my mother in her beaded designer gown. "Eleanor Vance!" The agent's voice boomed, projecting a terrifying, undeniable authority that sliced through the murmurs of the panicked crowd. My mother blinked, her heavily manicured hand fluttering nervously to her diamond necklace. The arrogance hadn't completely drained from her system yet. She still thought she was a wealthy matriarch who could simply speak to a manager to resolve an inconvenience. "Yes, I am Eleanor Vance," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but laced with indignation. "And I demand to know who is in charge of this absolute circus. You are completely ruining my son's grand opening." The agent didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper bearing the official seal of a federal judge. "Eleanor Vance," the agent announced, loud enough for every single influencer's live stream to capture with crystal clarity. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with 1 count of aggravated identity theft, 1 count of federal wire fraud, and 1 count of bank fraud in relation to the fraudulent procurement of a $400,000 home equity line of credit. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words hit the red carpet like a physical shockwave. The absolute deafening silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my mother's crystal champagne flute slipping from her trembling fingers. It hit the marble pavement and shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the expensive vintage wine splashing onto the hem of her designer dress. "What?" my mother gasped, the blood violently draining from her face, leaving her a ghastly, translucent shade of white. Her knees literally buckled, and my father had to grab her arm to keep her from collapsing onto the carpet. No, there has to be a mistake. I didn't do anything. Leo, tell them." "Mom?" Leo stammered, dropping the oversized golden scissors. He looked like a terrified child. "Mom, what is he talking about? What fraud?" "Ma'am, turn around immediately," the marshal barked, stepping forward and physically grabbing my mother's arm, spinning her around with clinical, unapologetic force. My mother began to hyperventilate, thrashing wildly against the marshal's grip, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "You can't do this. I am a respected member of this community. Get your hands off me. Richard, do something." She screamed at my father, who was standing frozen in visceral, pathetic terror, completely useless as the second marshal easily shoved him back behind the stanchions. The sharp, metallic click-clack of heavy steel handcuffs locking around my mother's wrists echoed over the red carpet. It was the most beautiful, symphonic sound I had ever heard in my entire life. She was sobbing hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her face in thick black rivers as the agent began loudly reciting her Miranda rights. The wealthy guests were physically backing away from them in absolute horror. Dozens of cell phone cameras were pointed directly at her, permanently cementing her humiliation in the digital stratosphere. While my mother was being dragged toward the back of the federal transport van, a second team of agents bypassed the sobbing mess entirely and approached the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant. Leo finally snapped out of his shock and lunged forward, physically throwing himself in front of the entrance to his beloved empire. "Hey, stop! You can't go in there! This is my property! This is my business!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. A senior federal asset recovery agent stepped up to Leo, pulling a bright yellow roll of adhesive tape and a stapled legal document from his tactical vest. "Step aside, sir," the agent commanded coldly. "This premises, and every single asset located within it, is being seized under a federal civil forfeiture warrant. We have irrefutable evidence that this business was funded entirely by the proceeds of a massive wire fraud operation. The building is closed. The assets are now the property of the United States government." "No!" Leo wailed, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked like he was watching someone burn his child alive. "That's a lie! I am the CEO! I built this! I secured the funding myself! My mother gave me that money!" That was my cue. I pushed open the heavy door of the Lincoln Navigator and stepped their boots onto the pavement. Arthur stepped out behind me, straightening his bespoke tie. Together, we walked slowly, deliberately across the street, illuminated by the chaotic, strobing flashes of the police lights. The sea of panicked guests and journalists naturally parted for us, sensing the predatory intent radiating from our approach. I walked straight onto the red carpet, stopping just a few feet away from where Leo was practically hyperventilating against the door of his seized restaurant. My mother, who was being aggressively patted down by a female agent against the hood of the van, whipped her head around and saw me. "Alice!" my mother shrieked, her voice tearing her throat. A sudden delusional flicker of hope ignited in her panicked eyes. She actually genuinely thought I was there to save her. "Alice, thank God, please tell them. Tell them it's a huge misunderstanding. Call your lawyer. They think I stole money." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my tailored black trousers. I looked at the pathetic, handcuffed woman leaning against the police cruiser. And then I looked at my brother, whose fraudulent empire was actively being taped off with yellow federal seizure tape. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a cold, jagged, utterly merciless expression. "I did call my lawyer, Mom," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the noise of the raid, ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. I gestured casually to Arthur, who was standing beside me with a look of smug satisfaction. "He's the one who handed your forged signature directly to the FBI. The silence that followed my admission was so absolute, so suffocatingly profound, that I could actually hear the crisp, synthetic crinkle of the yellow federal seizure tape being pulled across the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant. Every single camera flash seemed to freeze in midair. The entire crowd of wealthy socialites, food bloggers, and local influencers stood completely paralyzed, their smartphones still raised, capturing every agonizing millisecond of my family's catastrophic destruction. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide, unblinking, and entirely hollowed out by shock. The delusional, arrogant matriarch who had been sipping vintage champagne just 5 minutes ago had completely vanished. In her place was a broken, terrified, pathetic woman in handcuffs, realizing that the daughter she had treated like garbage her entire life was the one holding the match to her gasoline-soaked world. "You?" she choked out, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. You called the FBI on your own mother? Alice, how could you? I am your family. I gave birth to you." "You didn't act like family when you walked into that bank, Mom," I replied, my voice dangerously calm, projecting clearly into the dead silence of the street. "I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. You stole my identity. You forged my signature with your country club friend. You took out a $400,000 mortgage against the only thing Grandpa ever left me. You gambled my entire future, my financial security, and my home just so you could buy Leo a custom pizza oven and pretend you were high society. You aren't a mother. You are a federal criminal." My father, who had been cowering behind the velvet ropes, suddenly found a desperate, misguided burst of paternal courage. He pushed past a horrified food influencer and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Alice, stop this right now!" he screamed, his face turning a mottled, furious purple. "She is your mother. You tell these officers it was a misunderstanding. We were going to pay you back. Leo's restaurant was going to be a massive success, and we were going to quietly pay off the loan. You are ruining our lives over a temporary cash flow issue." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to that breathtaking display of delusion, Arthur stepped smoothly in front of me. He looked at my father with the cold, clinical disgust of a surgeon examining a tumor. "Sir, If you take one more step toward my client, I will personally ensure you are charged with witness intimidation and obstruction of a federal investigation," Arthur stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that instantly stopped my father in his tracks. And for the record, federal wire fraud is not a temporary cash flow issue. It is a Class C felony punishable by up to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings on your own house to recoup their stolen funds because you, sir, are a co-signer on the joint account that received the illicit wire transfers. You are legally complicit. My father's mouth opened and closed silently, like a dying fish. The realization that his own suburban home, his retirement, and his freedom were completely gone finally penetrated his thick skull. He physically staggered backward, leaning heavily against a brass stanchion just to keep himself upright. But the absolute most satisfying masterpiece of the night was happening a few feet away. Leo, the golden child, the CEO. Leo was staring at the federal agents who were now systematically locking heavy steel padlocks onto the front doors of the Golden Spoon. He looked down at the gold-plated ceremonial scissors sitting abandoned on the red carpet. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in real time. He spun around, his meticulously styled hair now a chaotic mess, sweat pouring down his forehead, ruining his expensive Tom Ford tuxedo. "Wait! No!" Leo shrieked, sprinting toward the lead FBI agent. "You can't seize this. I have a payroll run tomorrow morning. I have 25 staff members. I owe the imported meat vendors $50,000 by Monday. If you lock those doors, I'm ruined. I'll be bankrupt." The agent didn't even look up from his clipboard. "The LLC is currently under federal receivership, sir. Any outstanding vendor debts or payroll obligations are now frozen. The physical assets inside, the equipment, the alcohol, the furniture will be liquidated at federal auction to partially reimburse the defrauded financial institution." Leo's eyes darted frantically around the crowd, looking for a lifeline. He locked eyes with his PR director, the woman who had organized the entire event. She was staring at the federal agents, then down at her clipboard. Without saying a single word, she dropped her clipboard onto the pavement, turned on her heel, and fast walked away down the street, completely abandoning him. The waiters holding the trays of champagne slowly began setting them down on the sidewalk, realizing they were never going to see a dime for their work tonight. Cornered, desperate, and stripped of his manufactured empire, Leo did exactly what narcissists do when the ship is sinking. He viciously turned on his own allies. He marched over to the police cruiser where my mother was handcuffed. He didn't look at her with sympathy. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You told me it was an early inheritance," Leo screamed directly into his sobbing mother's face, spit flying from his lips. "You told me Grandpa left you a hidden trust fund. You lied to me. You funded my business with dirty money. You completely ruined my life. I'm going to be a laughingstock. I hate you." My mother recoiled as if she had been shot in the chest. The ultimate betrayal. The golden child, the son she had risked federal prison for, the boy she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect, was publicly throwing her under the bus to save his own pathetic ego. She let out a wail of absolute gut-wrenching despair, a sound so hollow and pathetic it almost made me pity her. Almost. "Let's go, ma'am," the marshal said coldly, completely unmoved by the family drama. He placed a heavy hand on her head and unceremoniously shoved her into the dark metal cage in the back of the federal transport van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening final bang that echoed down the block. I stood on the red carpet, breathing in the crisp night air. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the absolute wreckage of my toxic family. My mother was going to prison. My father was going to be homeless. My brother was going to be buried under mountains of debt and public humiliation for the rest of his miserable life. I turned to Arthur, giving him a small, genuine smile. "I think I've seen enough of the grand opening," I said quietly. "Let's go home." The morning after the raid was a Sunday. I woke up at my usual time, 7 in the morning, to the sound of birds chirping in the old-growth trees outside my bedroom window. The sunlight streamed through the glass, warming the hardwood floors of the home my grandfather had built. I walked into my custom kitchen, ground some fresh espresso beans, and brewed a perfect cup of coffee. I stood by the window, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic mug, and simply breathed. The air in my house had never felt so incredibly light. I took a sip of my coffee and allowed myself a moment to vividly imagine the stark, terrifying contrast of my mother's current reality. While I was enjoying a peaceful Sunday morning in my paid-off luxury home, she was waking up on a thin, plastic-covered mattress in a freezing federal holding cell, stripped of her designer gown, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, and facing the absolute horrifying destruction of her entire privileged life. But the emotional satisfaction was only phase 1. Monday morning was reserved for the brutal, surgical extraction of my financial liability. At 9 a.m. sharp, Arthur Sterling and I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank's regional corporate headquarters. We bypassed the tellers, bypassed the branch managers, and were escorted directly into a mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor. Waiting for us were the bank's vice president of risk management and their lead corporate counsel. They looked visibly nauseous. They already knew about the federal raid. The news of the FBI seizing assets funded by their institution had sent shockwaves through their executive suite. Arthur didn't even sit down. He tossed the thick dossier of evidence directly onto the center of the polished conference table. It landed with a heavy, threatening thud. "Gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice devoid of any professional courtesy. "Your institution authorized a $400,000 home equity line of credit against my client's property. Your loan officer accepted a forged signature. Your employee failed to properly verify the identification of the applicant, accepting outdated documents from a woman who is nearly 30 years older than my client. You allowed a corrupt notary to stamp fraudulent federal banking documents on your premises. And because of your gross, indefensible negligence, my client's title was clouded and her immaculate credit was decimated." The bank's corporate counsel tried to speak, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Sterling, please, we are actively conducting an internal investigation. The notary involved was an independent contractor." "I don't care if the notary was the Pope," Arthur snapped, leaning over the table, bringing his face inches from the executives. "My client is the victim of aggravated identity theft, facilitated by your bank's catastrophic failure to execute basic know-your-customer protocols. You are currently holding a fraudulent lien on her property. If that lien is not completely dissolved and the debt entirely expunged from her record by the end of business today, I am not just going to sue you for civil damages. I will file a massive public negligence lawsuit. I will contact the federal banking regulators to audit your entire branch's lending practices, and I will personally ensure this story hits the front page of the Wall Street Journal." The executives exchanged a panicked, terrified look. They knew they had absolutely no defense. Fighting this in court would cost them millions in legal fees and cause irreparable public relations damage, on top of the federal fines they would face for facilitating wire fraud. "The debt will be completely wiped from the account," the vice president said quietly, staring down at the table. "The lien will be officially released today. We will contact the credit bureaus immediately to expunge the derogatory marks from Ms. Vance's credit report. She will owe us nothing." I walked out of that boardroom less than 20 minutes later. My house was completely free and clear. My credit was restored. The trap had successfully closed, and I had emerged without a single scratch. While I was securing my freedom, my brother Leo was discovering the true, agonizing depth of his ruin. The PR firm he had hired to invite influencers to his grand opening had unwittingly orchestrated his digital execution. By Sunday afternoon, the raid on the Golden Spoon had gone massively viral. Dozens of high-definition videos flooded TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. They showed the FBI swarming the red carpet, my mother crying in handcuffs, and Leo having an absolute pathetic meltdown. The internet is utterly merciless, but they are especially merciless to arrogant, entitled people who get publicly humbled. The comment sections were an absolute bloodbath. Local food bloggers released videos titled, "The Golden Spoon, More Like the Stolen Spoon." People mocked his rented tuxedo, they mocked his speech about being self-made, and they endlessly reposted the clip of him screaming at his own handcuffed mother. He became a localized viral meme for fraudulent entitlement. His social reputation was permanently, irreparably pulverized. He couldn't even show his face at his favorite luxury coffee shops without people pointing and whispering. But the digital humiliation was nothing compared to the legal nightmare crashing down on his head. Leo had always believed that his LLC, Golden Spoon Hospitality, would legally protect his personal assets if the business failed. He thought that if the restaurant went under, the corporation would just declare bankruptcy, and he could walk away scot-free, ready to start his next scam. He was incredibly, tragically wrong. When a corporation is funded entirely by the proceeds of a federal crime, the legal protection of the LLC is instantly invalidated. It's called piercing the corporate veil. On Tuesday morning, Leo's phone began ringing off the hook. The federal government had seized the physical assets of the restaurant, the ovens, the furniture, the liquor, to auction off and partially repay the defrauded bank. But that seizure didn't cover the massive debts Leo had racked up on his own. He had signed personal guarantees with the PR firm, the meat purveyors, the interior decorators, and the private event staff. Because the LLC was a fraudulent entity, those vendors were now legally permitted to come after Leo personally. He was suddenly facing over $150,000 in unsecured debt, and he had absolutely zero income. His creditors didn't care that his mother had lied to him. They wanted their money, and they immediately began filing civil lawsuits against him. My phone rang only once during this entire week. It was a voicemail from my father, Richard. I listened to it while sitting on my patio, watching my dog chase a squirrel across the manicured lawn. His voice was completely broken, a pathetic, wavering mess of tears and desperation. Alice, please pick up," the voicemail pleaded. The bank is foreclosing on our house. They said because our joint account was used to transfer the stolen money, they're seizing our assets to cover the losses. Your mother's bail is set at $200,000, and I can't afford a bondsman. I don't have the money for her defense attorney. We are going to be living on the street, Alice. Please, you have to tell the FBI to drop the charges. You have your house back. You won. Please, just make this stop. We are your family. I calmly deleted the voicemail, permanently blocked his number, and took another sip of my coffee. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. I didn't feel a shred of pity. You don't get to detonate a bomb in someone else's life and then cry when the shrapnel hits your own face. They were my family, yes. But they were the ones who taught me that family means absolutely nothing when money is on the line. I was simply returning the lesson. The wheels of the federal justice system are notoriously, agonizingly slow, but when they finally grind, they pulverize everything in their path into a fine, inescapable dust. It has been exactly 2.5 years since that spectacular, siren-lit night on the red carpet outside the Golden Spoon. I have spent that time traveling, expanding my software sales consulting firm, and completely renovating the master suite of my grandfather's house. I have lived in absolute blissful peace. My toxic family, however, has spent the last 2.5 years living in a sustained, unrelenting nightmare of their own meticulous design. Let me walk you through the absolute surgical annihilation of the people who thought I was an easy target. Let's start with Susan Miller, the corrupt country club notary public who stamped the forged documents. When the FBI raided her pristine suburban office, she didn't possess an ounce of loyalty to my mother. She folded like a cheap lawn chair. To avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence, Susan accepted a brutal plea deal. She surrendered her notary license, pled guilty to felony accessory to wire fraud, and agreed to testify unconditionally against my mother. She avoided prison, but the judge sentenced her to 5 years of strict probation and ordered her to pay massive fines. The true punishment, however, was social. The wealthy, gossiping housewives at her country club completely ostracized her. Her husband, humiliated by the public scandal and the financial drain of her legal fees, filed for divorce. She went from drinking mimosas on the golf course to living in a cramped apartment, entirely exiled from the high society she loved so much. Then there is my father, Richard. For his entire life, he was the ultimate enabler, a passive man who stood by and watched his wife and son abuse me, preferring to keep the peace rather than do what was right. He learned the hard way that passive complicity carries a devastating price tag. Because his name was on the joint bank account that received the stolen $400,000, the federal government ruthlessly pursued him for restitution. The bank successfully foreclosed on his beautiful 5-bedroom suburban home. His retirement accounts were liquidated by federal order. Completely bankrupt and drowning in my mother's exorbitant defense attorney fees, he was forced to move into a depressing, dimly lit 1-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. To pay for his basic groceries and electricity, the man who used to mock my work ethic is now 68 years old, working the morning shift as a greeter at a discount big box retail store. Every day, he stands by the sliding glass doors wearing a cheap blue vest, handing out shopping carts to the very same people who used to attend his extravagant holiday parties. But the most poetic, spectacular downfall belongs to Leo, the golden child, the CEO of the Golden Spoon. When the federal government pierced the veil of his fraudulent LLC, the civil lawsuits from his unpaid vendors rained down on him like hellfire. He was hit with over $150,000 in personal judgments. With absolutely no assets, no college degree, and a viral digital footprint that made him utterly unemployable in any corporate setting, Leo was forced to declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy. But bankruptcy doesn't erase the deep psychological humiliation of falling from a pedestal you never deserved to be on. Last month, a mutual acquaintance sent me a photo they discreetly snapped at a fast food drive-thru at 2 a.m. There was Leo, the visionary entrepreneur. He was wearing a grease-stained polyester uniform and a paper hat, handing a paper bag of cheap cheeseburgers out of a drive-thru window. The man who bought a custom Italian pizza oven with my stolen money is now spending his nights scraping burnt fry grease off a grill for minimum wage. The universe has a brilliant, merciless sense of humor. But the absolute crown jewel of this revenge, the grand finale of my masterpiece, was my mother, Eleanor Vance. Because of her staggering, incurable narcissism, my mother refused to take a plea deal. She genuinely believed she could manipulate a federal jury the same way she had manipulated our family for decades. She took her case to trial. I sat in the very back row of the federal courthouse every single day, watching her expensive defense attorney try to paint her as a confused, loving mother who made a simple paperwork error. It was pathetic. Arthur Sterling sat next to me, quietly taking notes as the federal prosecutor clinically dismantled her life. They played the high-definition security footage of her forging my name. They showed the wire transfers, and then they put Susan the notary on the stand, who tearfully confessed that my mother had explicitly orchestrated the entire forgery to steal my equity. When the jury returned with the verdict, it took them less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud. I will never, for the rest of my life, forget the sound of my mother screaming when the federal judge handed down her sentence. The judge, a stern man who looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust, didn't show an ounce of leniency. He sentenced Eleanor Vance to 84 months, 7 full years, in a federal correctional institution, with no possibility of early parole. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff her, she whipped her head around, her eyes frantically scanning the gallery until she found me sitting in the back row. She looked at me, her face a horrific mask of terror, grief, and disbelief. She mouthed the word, "Please." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at her with the cold, dead eyes of a stranger, stood up, smoothed out my blazer, and walked out of the courtroom before they even finished dragging her through the side doors. I never looked back. People love to quote the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," to justify forgiving toxic family members. But they always forget the actual, original quote. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means that the bonds you choose to make are infinitely stronger than the genetic lottery you are born into. My parents and my brother tried to use the water of the womb to drown me. They thought my loyalty was a given, an exploitable resource they could mine until I was entirely empty. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was the black sheep. I spent my entire life learning how to survive out in the cold, entirely on my own. I didn't need their approval, I didn't need their love, and I certainly didn't need their permission to protect what was mine. Tonight, I am sitting in my grand living room. The fireplace is crackling, casting a warm, golden glow across the imported rugs. My rescue dog is sleeping soundly by my feet. My bank accounts are thriving, my business is scaling, and my property is locked down in a newly formed, impenetrable trust. The house is completely, beautifully silent. There are no frantic phone calls demanding money. There are no manipulative texts. There is only peace. I built a fortress. They tried to lay siege to it, and I burned their entire army to the ground. And if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a single glorious second.